Good afternoon, 7th grade history class, and welcome back to another edition of our daily lessons. Today we're going to be going over section 2 of chapter 22. Yesterday we finished up our notes in the first page of section 22, section 2 of chapter 22, talking about the first major battles of World War I. We talked a little bit about the Battle of Ypres, where the two forces were trying to outflank each other, and we talked a little bit about the miracle on the Marne River, which the Germans tried to overrun in their attempt to take Paris. We also talked about the defensive line between the Germans and the French. It's known as the Western Front. It stretches from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss Alps, and it's basically where the majority of the war is fought. The first major battle of the war was called the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun happens in 1916. Verdun is a big fortress in the country of France, and the guy by the name of Henri Pétain leads the French forces against the German onslaught, which at this time is about 500,000 men. The French will lose about 550,000 men at the Battle of Verdun. The Germans will lose about another 400,000. After that, we have the Battle of the Somme River. Again, kind of like the Marne River, the Germans are trying to take natural barriers such as rivers and hills and fortresses and to kind of establish a foothold in France. That way they can't be pushed out. Set up new trenches, and then move a little bit closer to Paris. The British guns pounded the German lines at the Battle of the Somme. The British lost again about another 600,000 men, and the Germans lost about another 500,000 men. So what you've noticed from these battles in World War I, they're very bloody, a lot of people are dying, and very little territory is being taken. After the Battle of the Somme, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, if you remember, he is the leader of Germany at this time, the Emperor of Germany. He actually dismisses his top generals at this time and replaces them with a guy by the name of Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg in 1916 becomes the supreme commander of all of the Central Powers forces. In 1916, we also have the biggest and only major naval battle of World War I. That is called the Battle of Jutland. The Battle of Jutland is the major battle of World War I. The German Navy is blockaded in the North Sea, and they're trying to break this blockade that the British have them surrounded with. Remember, the British Navy at this time is still the toughest in the world. And so the Germans realize if the war is going to continue, they have to punch a hole through this blockade that the British have around them. And this is why the Battle of Jutland happens. Of course, the Germans lose, and the blockade continues. In 1917, we have something called the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks are known as the majority. That's what the word Bolshevik means. Majority communists. It's when the communists take over the provisional government and the Tsarist government in Russia, and this happens in 1917, in November of 1917, even though it's called the October Revolution. And the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of the war as soon as they come to power. They're led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who leads essentially the communist revolution, and then we'll talk about him a little bit later on as we go further into Russia. But remember that the Russian Revolution happens in 1917, and the Bolsheviks take over the Russian Revolution and establish communism in Russia, and then pull Russia out of the war. At this time, a guy by the name of Winston Churchill is the First Lord of the Admiralty, which means he's in charge of the British Navy at this time. He's not the famous Prime Minister of World War II that we know of him later on in history. He launches something called the Gallipoli Campaign in World War I. Essentially, he tries to take over Gallipoli, which is the entrance to the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Strait in Turkey. And he loses to the Ottoman Empire, a great defeat, and loses a lot of prestige, makes the British look really, really bad, and they end up even firing him from the First Lord of the Admiralty. Of course, you have to remember that the United States is still technically neutral at this time, even though we are helping the British because we want them to win the war, as well as the French, we are officially neutral, which means we don't fire on any nations, and we expect no nations to fire upon us. A British luxury liner loaded with civilians, but also some supplies and weapons. It was heading from America to Great Britain. Its name was the Lusitania. The Germans knew that there was weapons on it and thus sank the boat, but also killed a lot of Americans. Almost 130 Americans and another 1,000 British ended up dying as the Lusitania was sunk. The United States demanded an apology from the Germans, and this is one of the reasons that the United States ends up joining on the Allied side in World War I. Another reason that the United States ends up joining the war is what's called the Zimmermann Note. A guy by the name of Arthur Zimmermann, who's the German foreign secretary, or foreign minister at this time, sends a letter to the country of Mexico, and asks Mexico to join Germany in the war. And they basically tell Mexico, if you join Germany and you defeat the United States, we're going to give you back the land that the United States took from you at the end of the Mexican-American War. So basically what they're saying is, if you help Germany win the war against the U.S. and England, we're going to give you back Texas, California, New Mexico, Utah, and so on. The only problem is the note is intercepted by the British and they hand it over to the United States. And so this is another reason that the United States says, look, we're neutral and you're over here planning to attack us with Mexico. And so this is why we end up officially joining the war. And of course, we're going to be on the Allied side. And so on April 6, 1917, about a year before the war ends, the United States joins the war. We officially ask Congress. President Woodrow Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war. They give them the declaration of war, and then the American doughboys, as they're called, American soldiers, are sent over to France under a guy named John J. Pershing. If you remember when we talked a little bit about the Roosevelt administration, the turn of the century, there was a guy by the name of Pancho Villa who was killing Americans in the American Southwest. John J. Pershing was the man sent to go capture him. He's now the man leading the American Expeditionary Force of about 300,000 Americans going over to France to fight the Germans. About a year and a half after the United States joins the war, on November 11th, 1918, on the 11th day, on the 11th month, on the 11th hour of the fourth year of fighting, peace or an armistice is declared. An armistice just means a ceasefire. The peace treaty ending the war is not going to happen for a little bit longer after this, but there's an armistice that officially ends the war on November 11th, 1918. Even still today, we celebrate this as Veterans Day. Once the war is over, then the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, is going to be drawn up to kind of determine the terms of the peace following the war. President Woodrow Wilson proposes something called the 14 points for peace. And his 14th and last point is what he calls the League of Nations. He wants to essentially create the precursor to what the United Nations is today. He wants to create an organization in which every country in the world participates and they hold each other accountable and don't go to war with each other. This is called the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is actually going to fail because of World War II. League of Nations doesn't have its own army or anything, so they can't implement any kind of rules that they have. The United Nations is a little bit different. They actually have their own military force. But the League of Nations is a joining of states or countries around the world for international peace. Ironically, the United States, even though we're the country that started the League of Nations, we're the only country, major country, that doesn't join the League of Nations. This is because Congress doesn't support President Wilson, and so they don't support the United States joining the League of Nations. It's not up to him, it's up to Congress. And so we're the only major power that doesn't join the League of Nations. If you noticed, we just went over all of the notes for section 2 of chapter 22. Hopefully you've been doing the reading between pages 334 and 337. Once you have all of the notes written down, we've also gone over all of the quiz terms. Now you're going to be taking quiz number 33 today, and then quiz number 34 over the next section tomorrow. We've gone over all of these quiz terms. They're also in your reading as well as in your notes. So whenever you're finished with your reading and you feel prepared enough, go ahead and take this quiz number 33. And as soon as you finish it up, go ahead and send it in with your parents, or mail it in, or fax it in, or whatever you're doing to send it into school so I can grade it for you and record it into the Jupiter grades. That's pretty much all I have for you guys today. I hope you all enjoyed the lesson. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy, and I hope you guys have a great day.